everybody. Professor Snart here. Hopefully you had a good and restful spring break. Enjoyed the weather wherever you were. And now we are back for, I'm going to call it about the last month or so of our class. There's actually a little bit more than that, but we'll call it a month so it feels like a nice round block of time. Okay. So we've just finished up, or actually finished up a while ago, what with the spring break in there, our first poetry unit, Unit 9, where we looked at not even poetry so much as theories of really creativity generally, but as voiced by T.S. Eliot, a really famous poet, and then reworked in a what I think is a pretty surprising way in that Gwen Stefani commercial for HP, where they both basically talk about this notion of the poetic mind or the creative mind as one that just collects fragments of things, pieces, little visual things, words, experiences, whatever it happens to be, and they just kind of exist in our creative space. And they don't necessarily mean anything until that one, like Eliot says, the one catalyst is introduced, and that's the thing that sort of brings the whole thing together. And so it's a sort of appealing, I mean, like I've said before, I like it because it resonates with what I guess I was already thinking without really being aware that I thought of it that way. So it put into words an idea that I felt like I was already, that was my theory without even calling it a theory. But it also, like, as so many people pointed out in their discussion board posts, it identifies creativity as this thing that you can't just turn off and on. It's almost sort of like always on, which is a nice way of thinking about it. It's always an active thing because we as poets or as writers are like gatherers. That's why it's really important as a writer to be attentive to the world, the immediate experience that you're having, like in terms of how things sound and what they look like and how people behave, but also to be just an active kind of consumer of things, whether it's art or music or text. And it doesn't have to be like famous literary important stuff. It's the everyday, the pop culture stuff too. And all of those pieces, they might not seem important until that one shows up, and then a whole group of those fragments coalesce into a poem. And so Eliot's an interesting character, of course, because he was both a practicing poet but also a theorizer about poetry. So you can almost see how, I guess it's a nice combination, because he can provide a theory of something like creativity and tradition and the individual talent, but then you can actually see it in practice in the poetry. So the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, again, one of his most famous poems, I think it provides good evidence of the way that it seems to be assembled of fragments, although it, at the end of it, has a kind of overall unity, even if a lot of the, what I would call the connective tissue between the pieces has been removed. So we sort of jump from one image to another, to a totally different one, like the women coming and going, talking of Michelangelo. That seems disconnected because there's no nice smooth transition from one opening scene to the next. But taken holistically, I think it does give us a kind of unified feeling. And so another thing that I wanted to talk about really briefly is when it comes to poetry, especially with someone like Eliot, who is intentionally elusive, intentionally kind of difficult. And if you think about the theory of fragments coming together, well, they're still sort of fragments. So it's not like you take fragments and we get this nice, perfect, explained piece of poetry. It still has that kind of jumpy, fragmentary feel to it. And again, intentional on Eliot's part. But it makes it hard to get, quote unquote. And so a lot of people are turned off because they read it once and they don't, again, quote unquote, get it. But I sort of like to challenge the idea of what we mean by getting it. And again, you read it once and you don't get it. Well, again, it's sort of Eliot's challenge to our conventional systems of reading, where just because you don't get it the first time through, it doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong, or that the poem's bad, or the poet's craft is bad. It means that it demands more of our time and attention, which really runs counter to so much of what our culture is about in the 21st century, and even in Eliot's time in the early to mid 20th century. Just the pace that we move is so fast. It's almost like, intentionally or otherwise, that kind of approach to poetry that he practices and that so many others did is like a challenge to our fast-paced, like, give me the soundbite, give me the shortest version, and then I can move on to something else, the sort of drive-through culture that we're part of, the fast food culture. It works against that. And so if you have to read it twice, again, 3 times, it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means that you're investing time in a work of art that will, with that investment, repay dividends, to put it in like financial terms. In other words, it will open up new meanings for you, but it's not just like an intellectual getting it that we care about so we could do a test on it, like put it into one paragraph or one sentence. T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is a poem about, and then if you can fill that sentence in, you pass the test, but if you can't, then you've somehow failed. That's a really, really limited view, but I know it's one that we're conditioned through like high school and maybe even into college, but hopefully not. But it's a way of engaging with poetry that we're sort of conditioned for, right? Is that intellectually, analytically, that's the way we're supposed to engage with these things. And certainly there's part of that, but I'd like to suggest that there's another, less, tangible, testable kind of way that we engage with work. Like, does it have an emotional effect on you? Not to get confused with, right, what Eliot has to say about emotion and poetry, because that's more about the poet's own emotion and just sort of spilling them out on the page. That's what he was against, and I don't think we get that in Prufrock at all. But it doesn't mean that the reader can't have a kind of like gut reaction, even if you can't formulate it into a nice little thing that we could do a multiple choice test on. If you have a kind of gut reaction to it, if you sense that something's going on there, then you reread and you get more of that visceral reaction and more of the intellectual analytical part as well. So I guess the short version is we need to reframe what we mean by getting it. And for our purposes, especially in a class like this where I don't test you on the meaning of the poem in some like Scantron, don't even get me started, just mass testing kind of a way. We care about it as a poem, as a work of art, and does it produce an effect on the reader? Even if that effect is frustration on your part because the parts don't fit together, like, that's not a mistake. It doesn't mean you're reading it wrong. That's how the poem is supposed to embody that sense of his experience of the early 20th century, but also this theory of creativity that speaks to, right, a poem as the gathering together of fragments. So anyway, I could go on at length about that because I think we do such a disservice to people and their appreciation of poetry and art in general in the way that it's taught, kind of like K through 12 almost. Anything that is taught with a view to like a multiple choice or some sort of standardized test is just, it leaves so much out. Okay, I'll cut myself off there. Are you bored at looking at just a blank screen so far? All right, so spring break we've just had. Now I'm back and I'm all like anxious about this again. So we go into our poetry workshop, which I think for some people a little intimidating, but it should be exciting. So leave all the baggage about poetry that you've got at the door, that it has to rhyme, that it has to be about big, important philosophical things. That's why I suggest to reread our rules of creative writing. They're really, really important here, so you can kind of get rid of all the baggage that people have when it comes to poetry. So you're posting by Thursday, right? Feedback by Sunday. And again, the pieces are often short, so we have bigger groups. But really do your best on the feedback part, not just to make like 1 or 2 comments, even if the poem is quite short, but really try to dig in there and talk about word choice and line breaks and punctuation and capitalization and use of the white space of the page. The sort of intensity of the thing doesn't come from a sheer word count. It's again more about the effect on the reader and how does it achieve that effect. Then we turn around to our next set of student conferences, a one-on-one chance for us here. And I'm just going to pop into that real quick. So these ones are much more unlike our first go-round here where it's just like, how are things going? Here we want to really talk about what have you learned in the class, or what are you learning? What questions are coming up that you haven't really had answered yet? So be sure you get in here, sign up for a time. We can meet face-to-face, we can meet virtually, but that's part of our schedule. So again, jump in there sooner rather than later. And then due date-wise, you'll notice that we kind of get really towards the end. We have our conferences, we have a final open genre workshop where you can just write in any genre, one we've done before, maybe one that we haven't done before. And then we have our final unit coming up towards the beginning of May. So we're getting down to it. Hopefully you're enjoying the class and getting something out of it. And especially because we're this deep into it, you're beginning to see some trends or some ideas that are taking hold. And even because we've done a lot of writing, if you think about it, if you take a moment to reflect backwards, writing is not something that you spend like 8 weeks doing and then, oh my gosh, I'm like way better now. Sometimes you make a really noticeable leap, but it's really more an incremental thing. So it's fun to take a moment to look back a little bit and see, are there habits that you have as a writer that are good or bad? Are there things that you know you need to work on? Like we're deep enough into the course where you might not be a totally different writer, but you probably can see some trends, right? And hopefully those are positive and good. And that is largely what we want to talk about here. Okay, so welcome back. Hopefully we have some renewed energy as we get into our poetry workshop here. And any questions, concerns, you can always be in touch with me.